Namaste, hello everyone. Welcome to the NPTEL course Role of Craft and Technology in Interior Architecture. Today we are going to discuss the last module of the course, and it summarizes all the different kinds of interventions that we have discussed so far. And like I told last time, we will also touch upon briefly the spatial interventions, because it's very important that we talk about space, because this course talks about building crafts and the interventions within the craft sector that talk about space making and the milieu of interior architecture. So this is what this special section is about. So we will be seeing that. Broadly seeing the contents for today, like of course I just told all the different kinds of interventions that we saw: process based, product or design based, technology based, marketing management based, and this special section that we will talk about. It will be very brief and I will be majorly focusing on architecture and textiles, and particularly talking about the works of architect and theorist Gottfried Zemper. So we will see some examples and of course towards the end the references. So I will not be discussing in detail, there are a lot of visuals and I will be flipping over what all we discussed. So basically we had these four classifications under the umbrella of kinds of interventions, and we discussed about them one by one. So we started with the process based interventions and we tried to understand the concept of the open craftsman, where a lot of focus is given to the local communities and the sharing of ideas and knowledge is encouraged. We also tried to understand this case from Spain, where this methodology was adopted, where on one hand the overall inventorization and understanding of the existing industry was taken into concern, and then here on the right hand side there was this mix of constant and variables, and different craft design scenarios were established to understand how by playing with these constant and variables, different craft design scenarios can be worked upon and explored. So we saw this case study. We also tried to understand the very important craft design process and what is the craft design collaboration all about, and how craft and design sectors, they share a very symbiotic relationship, and while the craft persons possess the profound knowledge of material and they have their skill sets, designer also gives a lot of design inputs and also tries to connect the craft persons and the communities to the market. So that kind of collaborative process we saw. We also tried to understand the design intervene craft making process, which focuses essentially on co-creation and not just this typical linear process from the initial stage to the final stage of product delivery and evaluation, but how the co-creation happens and how the exchange of ideas happen. So we understood that. Continuing our discussions with craft design process, we tried to understand the importance of establishing collaborations and how that collaboration helps in expanding the craft vocabulary and creating new markets. So that was the discussion on craft design process, and taking case studies again to understand it further, we again tried to understand the importance of co-creation, where artisans and designers work together with the shared knowledge and work towards achieving a certain goal. Then there are a lot of knowledge exchange that happens between the local craft industry, other industries, and there is import and export of knowledge from one side to the other, and how design interventions play a crucial role in connecting the two of them, and the different kinds of interventions leading to the completely new way of looking at the craft sector. So we try to understand that. To understand the process based interventions, we also saw one example focusing on the apron art of Uttarakhand, and then we saw how the blend of apron design with applique is providing a very imaginative and fresh collection to the people who want to adopt their tradition with some modernization and contemporary expressions. So we saw this example where the adaptation of original motifs on fabric through applique work is done and different product ranges developed for a new market. we saw such examples. We also saw this very interesting case study from Thailand, where the craft persons adopted very sustainable ways, and they tried to work with natural resources and the naturally available materials that they had, and completely redefine their product range and also the way of looking sustainability by utilizing these naturally available resources and not relying on the market based raw material. So this was again an interesting example. We were also trying to understand the different processes, and we were seeing how different diagrams and different existing literature explains the different processes involved with craft. So like what we saw, the craft design collaboration and a co-creation process, we also saw another diagram where it emphasized that craft begins with problem identification and then it leads to further stages. So we saw such process diagrams to understand the craft design collaborations in craft sector. We also saw this creative process, how it is nurtured through the set of different activities which are interconnected to each other, and they all contribute, and then this process is actually taken ahead. And we were trying to understand design innovation process, where we could see that it's not a linear process starting from problem finding to some final evolving, but there are in between stages, and then there are curves, so it's a process again. It involves different stages. We saw this very interesting example of craft design collaboration between DICRC and Craft Canvas, and how this modular storage system has been designed. So the designer and the craft persons work together with a traditional craft form of wood turning and lacquer work, and they tried something very contemporary and they explored this. And after that we tried to have a look at the product and design based interventions, and before actually seeing those interventions, we tried to understand what are the issues and challenges and what are the problems with the existing craft sector. And then there was this emphasis on lack of innovative products and of course lack of technological advancements, because we are going to see also the summary of what we saw within the technology intervention part. And again, a lot of data and charts, they highlight the marketing related issues and of course the issues related to the product development. And again we saw here some weaknesses. So we tried to understand all of this, and which led us to the understanding that design interventions are quite necessary and need of the hour. So to understand design interventions, what they actually mean, we try to understand the existing literature and different models that are into play, and how design interventions are completely they just give a very new way of looking at the existing products, and they redefine the craft sector, and they also open a lot of opportunities which are untapped. So we try to understand that and get a hang of things about what design interventions actually mean. We saw some case studies. We saw the Kala Raksha Vidyalaya and how it has really progressed and evolved, and the craft persons there are living sustainably with their craft forms, also open to the interventions, the new prototypes and products, and designing everything which is demanded by the market. So that was the one case study which we studied, and we also tried to understand the problem. So like generally this designer meets artisans model is practiced, but what are the problems was explained through the case study of Kala Raksha and the founder, where the craft person is just reduced to a laborer and designer just comes and instructs what to do. So that's where this model fails. It has to be a creative liberty and collaboration. So we try to understand those kinds of problems and what this case study and model serves best, so that there are a lot of learnings from it. So interesting examples how the digital portfolio for each craft person is maintained, and then communication and identity building is done through the online portal, and interesting new technologies, web based technologies are incorporated. and then there are a lot of ways to disseminate and exhibit and have outreach of all the products, and where the artisan and the craft person also participates in this dissemination, and it gives them confidence. So we also try to understand different kinds of new explorations, where the traditional craft processes are combined with contemporary ways, and they are also integrated in commercial space making applications. So those kinds of explorations are happening, and craft persons' knowledge and modeling skills are now being linked to the cultural and creative industries, and there is this whole new range of ideas and new platforms that are emerging. We discussed about this. We also saw some examples where there is the intervention in terms of contemporary expression altogether, or in terms of technique and joinery, starting from the existing product to the final new product, and different medium to express through that craft form that we came across. We saw some examples of building crafts, and how the product intervention has happened, and how a particular thing was used earlier, and what are the different ways of using it now. So we saw some example of thikri kam also, how it was done earlier and now it is completely a different expression. Some more examples of application, and we saw some more making of products where the idea is very rooted to the tradition, but the form and expression has changed, and the material exploration is also new. And we saw some product interventions which are done by Alaya Design Studio, and we just went through them and tried to understand what they are doing with the different craft persons, and they are coming up with this new vocabulary of completely new product range. So we see all these here on the slide, all that we discussed the other day. Again, some of them are like very naturally available materials and very ecological. So we saw all these products, some interesting interventions there. Then we progressed towards the technology based interventions, and we tried to understand how integrating technology is having a major impact on redefining the craft sector, and how it is improvising the production and sales and giving chances to craft persons for better standards of living. We try to understand that, and we also try to understand, when we talk about technology intervention, what kind of factors are in play, what are the major considerations. So broader consumer market, and then this whole new interest in making and craft products with a completely different vision, and democratization of design, do it yourself culture, promoting sustainability, all these important aspects. Then we saw the case of European craft revival, and tried to understand how they also emphasize on technology interventions and focus on digital fabrication and digital technology. We tried to see that. We saw some examples from National Innovation Foundation, where some innovation has been taken care of, and we saw this example from Gujarat, and very step by step we had discussed how the little technical know-how and intervention at small levels has really improvised this craft community and their ways of living, specifically few of them who were particularly open to new ideas, and how the explorations with new materials, with different kind of joinery, different kinds of product range, and along with these product and design interventions, there were also interventions in the lathe on which the wood is turned, and how it has drastically improved the production. So all that we discussed the case of this craft form, and we discussed about the craft persons particularly involved, how they work, what are the different machines they use, what is the space that they use, what are the different stages in which this craft takes shape, and then at each particular stage how things are done, it was explained through illustrations. Also the making of lacquer and then transportation, all that was discussed. Their existing product range was discussed. The tools that they work with were also discussed. And we tried to understand, that there are two clusters who practice the same craft form. One is in Dholka, the case study that we did in detail, and the other one is Nirona. And we saw the regional variations and how one cluster is flourishing while other is almost languishing because they have not really taken into account the upgradation part. So while one in Nirona still uses the Patri, the traditional lathe, which is completely done with hands and it can accommodate only small scale products, and it's time consuming. So there they have been facing a lot of problems with production, while the other one in Dholka, they have agreed to the technology intervention and they use the power lathe, which minimizes the time consumption and increases the productivity and also accommodates larger and thicker sections of wood, allows for material explorations, and also gives way to experimenting with different forms and joinery. So that kind of discussion was done to understand that how by technology intervention the efficiency is drastically increased, the time duration at each stage is reduced, the number of craftspersons involved at each stage is minimized, and the overall productivity goes high. So that was discussed, and different explorations in joinery and forms and different kinds of prototypes that were done. They were so interesting that there were already projects coming in for these craft persons. So that again sort of reached to the market and there was demand and there was a lot of experimentation that happened because of these different interventions, be it design or be it the technology. Both of them actually played an important role. So that kind of discussion we did, and the different kinds of explorations we saw which emerged out of the workshops that happened as craft design collaborations between the craft community and the DICRC at CEPT University. So we try to understand this important aspect of intervention and how important it is to work hand in hand with the craft persons, and how important it is that they are also receptive to the new ideas. So we understood that, and yeah, we tried to understand what was the need for these interventions and why they were actually introduced and how drastically they improved the cluster. Then we moved on to the market and management based interventions, and we quickly tried to understand that there is this new trend where mass customization is emphasized upon, and how design is no more an isolated activity, and it requires lot of plugging in from different other disciplines and sources, and it's important to also take into account the design management part, and finally of course the marketing of the product. So that we try to understand. Then we also saw certain existing researches which talked about market interventions, where the different kinds of markets were targeted, which had different scales of economy and different users whose needs they were catering to. So we tried to understand that, and we also saw this very interesting market value standards, how they could be based either on inheriting the traditional techniques and materials or completely on innovating the techniques, materials and design. So we tried to understand. Then we also saw how important are market linkages, and starting from the craft cluster all the way till the dissemination and outreach and the sales, the market linkages and financial support, they are very important, and it's very important to understand the factors that come into play when the market linkages are identified and they are worked closely with each other. We also saw some case study from China where we were trying to understand what are the interventions that actually happen at market level and how China sees the craft sector in terms of the interventions. And further, there were different levels at which the case study was discussed. So we saw that. We also tried to decipher a craft product in terms of materials, product type, design style and technique, which gives a fair understanding of different stakeholders and also helps us understand the value chain and final linkages to the market. So we try to understand that different elements that compose the craft product. Then very interestingly we saw the market positioning options for craft products and how different categories of craft products are identified, and then there are different attributes which are given to them, and eventually there is also the identification of which craft product or which range goes to which kind of market and what kind of price it fetches, and what is the supply demand game over there depending on the end users and the buyers. So that kind of interesting study we saw, and we try to understand what is a value chain and how is it important while we are talking about management and marketing. And then we saw factors that drive the companies to go global and how market forces play a very important role in that, reinforcing the study why we took up this module and why in general we were talking about interventions after all in all these modules. We also discussed a little bit about the market channels and what an important role they play again when we are talking about the marketing and management in the craft sector. Moving on, we try to understand what is the supply chain management, what are the different stages, what are the different role players within that, why is it important, how does a global supply chain come into picture, and what is it when we talk about the domestic supply chain, and how do they differ and how do they really impact the market forces and the different stakeholders involved. We also try to understand the supply chain drivers and what are their functions, and we try to see this diagrammatically, the supply chain management, how it happens. And we also very briefly discussed the supply chain management issues in India and what are the different problems and challenges that one faces, and that it is important to take care of them and work towards them so that these issues are resolved and the this gap between supply and demand reduces, and finally the outreach to market improves, saleability of craft products improves, the bottlenecks are reduced. So we had that kind of discussion. So this was an overall summary of what we discussed within this module of interventions. So now, having discussed all the four different kinds of interventions that we saw during the last 4 modules, we will now see the interventions that are spatial and which involve the interrelationship between craft and interior architecture. So we discussed these 4 types, and this one I have added here, which talks about the spatial interventions. So like I told in beginning that particularly we are going to discuss about Gottfried Zemper. He was a leading architectural theorist of 19th century, and he is very famous for his work, The 4 Elements of Architecture, where he considered earth for the foundation, associated wood for construction, textile for enclosure, and fire for climate. So when we talk about spatial intervention, the most important for us is to understand how he saw textiles being used for creating enclosure and space making. He also talked about the importance of color, and he also emphasized on the tectonic arts. So he believed paint was used on classical buildings as a protective material. So it was not just aesthetical, but Zemper believed that it was a protective material, and that's also what we see in a lot of ancient techniques of mural and painting, where the coat or the layer is described as protective, which prevents the underneath layer from weathering, insects and lot of other different issues. So that is what the Zemper emphasized upon. Also, statues from all cultures were polychromatic instead of their current monochrome appearance. This is also highlighted in the works. Color had symbolic associations, and color played a very profound role within the interior architecture, and also it is an expression of artistic freedom. So, we see here an inventory which talks about the material, the technique associated with it, like the technique of making, and the space making elements which could be associated to that particular material with the technique of making. So, clay, the technique that is associated with clay is ceramics, and the space making element is hearth. And when we talk about wood, it's basically carpentry, and for the construction of roof as a space making element within the gamut of space making principles. Textile technique is weaving, and it generates enclosure, and enclosure could be understood in terms of the space making element that is wall. And stone for masonry, and of course we associate it with the construction of substructure. So, that is a kind of inventory that talks about the material, the technique, and the space making element, something that we have been discussing throughout this course, how to identify certain material, the technique of making that goes with it, and the space making element that it contributes in the making of, and that is how we see this interrelationship between material, building craft, interior architecture, space making. So, these are some colored depictions from Zemper's early travels, and there are investigations which talk about the observations related to color, making, details, tectonics, ornamentation. So, we see some pictures over here. Of course, there are also many other works which are very significant when we talk about Zemper, and then we see this focus on science, industry and art and amalgamation, and the necessity of inventions and the advancement of arts and sciences. So, how there is a profound role of art, craft when we also talk about sciences. Then there is this comparative theory of building which emphasizes on methods of building and making. And then of course the very famous style, tectonic arts and the practical aesthetics, which is more relevant when we talk about today's section on spatial interventions. So, here this work in 1859, it focuses on use of materials within arts, crafts and architecture, and then details involved in the tectonic arts. Architectonics, some term that emerged out of this kind of work and theory and the kind of applications that Zemper exemplified. So, architectonics in antiquity as well as in the current architecture. So, also categorization of different styles. So, all of these are very significant works. Then when we talk about architecture and textiles, we see that in recent times theorists, architects, engineers, textile designers, material scientists, artists, they have all expressed a renewed interest in the possibilities that the combination allows. Also, the origins of architecture according to Zemper did not originate from the primitive hut, but from the arts. The first structure, the original abode of man, required not just structure but the weave, the knot, the textile and the tangible. So, that is where the weave and the knot come into picture, and Zemper tried to study the structure within them and try to understand how they could also contribute in space making and how architecture is incomplete without the integration of textiles and without this sense of enclosure. Also, textiles provide protection from heat and cold, absorb noise and give control of the amount of light entering the view. Textiles further possess very special, sensually tangible, often poetic aesthetics. Then, being simultaneously a functional technique and a symbolic means of representation, the knot. It was a mediating figure between the ritual act, the technique of making, and the actual work of art or craft. So, we are talking about exploring the knot here that we see within textiles and how it has a very significant role in the work of art, craft and also architecture, because basically the focus is technique of making and the structural nuances of knot. So, here we see certain drawings where the knot and the structure within the weave, it has been explored. Having identified the original motives of art, Zemper sought to map their development and inclusion in architecture. A key link in this development was the space-making element wall, which he traced back to the technique of weaving. So, technique of weaving, the role of knot, and then trying to explore the structure within the technique of weave making to create an enclosure and a space-making element like wall. The original enclosure, he argued, was not the solid wall of stone or wood, but rather the primitive fence woven by branches and grass. So, again the very important role of weaving as a technique which contributed in space making. The beginnings of building coincide with those of weaving. Zemper declared, "The first volume of the style was meant to provide substantial documentation for this assertion. Tracing the motif of enclosure from the primitive fence to textile draperies, Zemper found the principle of clothing or dressing to be intrinsically linked to spatial enclosure, a use that preceded even the clothing of the human body." So, that is what we have also discussed in previous few modules when we were talking about architectural clothing or skin. So, that is the concept of clothing or dressing that was given by Zemper, and it is linked to spatial enclosure, and he has done enormous work in asserting this kind of linkages. Some more drawings and pictures, and here the techniques of crochet and knitting are also highlighted, and it illustrates the potential for structural arrangements and space defining qualities that textile crafts possess. Some more examples from Maori architecture, a community that builds for their own living, and simple textile techniques of weave and the knot. They constitute the joining techniques of structural elements. So, we see that in this architecture over here. Again, some more illustrations. We see over here weaving, structural implications. These are some contemporary examples. So, this is a cultural complex, and we see this spectacular glimmering facade, which is a eulogy to Zemper's clothing or dressing. So, expressions could be different for contemporary times, and there are a lot of projects I have put very briefly. Another architect who also significantly tries to explore the applications of architecture and textiles is Dominic, a Paris-based architect, and we see some of the works over here. So, he is very famous for extensive textile-based architectural urban designs. Then we see this timber fabric. So, Shigeru Ben and Arup, they have explored it together. So, the woven knotted structures which are researched, and then their application is done in huge architectural projects to explore the large scale structural systems. This is another very interesting example, carbon tower design, and here also we see the use of membrane and the textile architecture. So, that is again like weaving a building, and this is just a potential reality as exemplified by this project. In fact, there are more examples. Due to the shortage of time I have not put it, but during the discussion forums we can talk about them. And There are cases from India also. We see the application at the surface as well as structural levels, where the ikat art is seen in the interiors, the fabrics, the upholstery, and also now in the facade of the buildings, and lot of other different examples. Few we have already seen in the previous modules. So that's a significant section, and I just wanted to discuss few examples focusing on these partial interventions. Now, since I said this is the last module, I really hope that the course was very useful and informative, and there are a lot of references, and for you to go through them in detail and come up with different kinds of exercises and understand the subject better. It would be completely open and one would expect some initiatives. So let's see some references. So some particular case studies that we discussed during the intervention part, they are mentioned over here. And we have been talking about scenarios of design and craft, we have been talking about craft design explorations, and in general we have been talking about interventions as a form of inquiry. We saw this case study of Kala Raksha Vidyalaya. We saw some more references on intervention part, and of course there is a consolidated list of references that we have been referring to, and we were talking about some case studies about Thikri Kam within this summary module also. So all of these references are put over here, and in general about craft and interior architecture that we have been anyway referring to. Thank you.